Our second session for this evening is a conversation titled Desiring Beings, Dissident Chorus, and it's a pleasure to welcome poet, playwright, and translator Athena Farrokhzad and poet, author, and translator Meena Kandasamy. This session will be moderated by Natasha Ginwala, artistic director, Colomboscope and Sharjah Biennial 16 co-curator. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome again to the second day of March meeting, and happy Women's Day. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with these two incredibly fierce and radically imaginative poets, writers, translators, working at the intersection of the production of justice, thinking through ancestral memory. I think to carry songs resonates in different ways also with this title, Desiring Beings, Dissident Chorus. We have a short time together and we have a lot to chat about, so we will try and make the most of this moment together with you. Athena Farrokhzad is a Swedish poet, playwright, critic. I also want to foreground the fact that she hasn't just published several books of poetry that have been translated across over 20 languages, but she also is very much an organizer, a comrade of other poets. And in this role, she has established a brilliant program as the head of literature at the House of Culture in Stockholm in recent years. She has translated the books of Audre Lorde, of Fadi Judah, of Natalie Diaz, of Marguerite Duras, of Adrienne Rich. And she also is a professor at the Linköping University in Sweden. Meena Kandasamy is a long admired figure for me personally. Again, not only her work as a writer, but also as an anti-caste activist, as an academic in Chennai. Her writing aims to deconstruct trauma and violence, but also spotlights gender justice, thinks through the ways in which ethnic oppressions, the way in which the enduring curve of war is not something that is bound by the current destruction in our midst, but the way she has actually witnessed and stood together with people's struggles across India, also in Sri Lanka, is something that I greatly admire about her work. She was also elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and was awarded the PEN Harman Keston Prize for her writing and work as a fearless fighter of democracy, human rights, and the free world. Free word, not the free world. So before we do a couple of readings, I wanted to make this bridge between your work as a poet, translator, in both cases, really thinking about the act of translation, not in this sense of providing a service, but literally the act of translation as a way of carrying history, of thinking even from orature to the written word. This kind of translation, across time, across forms of identity, thinking also between generations of writing. This is also something that I think we're going to closely address, and it speaks to some of our work as co-curators of this biennial. One of the other kin poets that we invoked in our first conversation together is the indigenous poet, language activist Natalie Diaz, whose work Athena has translated. And one of the things that she spoke about in an interview was that her words are too beautiful, so I'm just going to read. She said, in this particular moment, we need to grieve. And the English language and lexicons we have given for grief teach us that it's not natural to grieve. And I find this so potent. And so again, this life of translation and this limitation across language, across inherited and lost languages. Perhaps we start there.
Good evening, everyone. What a pleasure to be here in your company, Natasha and Meena, and thank you to Sharjah Art Foundation and to all of you for being here tonight. Well, you know, we're writers, the three of us, but I think more than anything, maybe we are readers. And translation, to me, is the most intimate form of reading. You know, I translate what I love in order to be able to come as close to it as possible. And it's a very formative experience. Translating Natalie Diaz has turned me into another poet. And as you were mentioning, because Natalie is being an indigenous activist, she's also very vocal around the genocide in Gaza. And I translated a good friend of hers, as you were mentioning, Farrokhzad, who is a Palestinian-American poet, and he says something very interesting in relation to what you're mentioning about the English language. He says, you know, English, because he writes in English, although he's Palestinian, English cannot think of us Palestinians as alive and loving humans. English can only think of us as passive or dead. And I think this relates to what you're saying, because our work as poets and writers is very much about making space for the thinkable inside language in order to make it possible in the material world. So I think we struggle with that all the time. Or what do you say, Meena?
No, it's very illuminating what you said. But also I think the other thing with English is that translation into English is also, at least in the case of India where you have multiple languages, English itself has become a site of resistance. So in a country with, you know, where we are Tamil speaking people and we constantly face, after the end of British colonialism, a type of Hindi colonialism, an imposition on our language that we think will take away our identity. So English becomes, in a very particular context, a way to hold your ground and say, I want to speak to the world, but I also want to be myself and retain this identity as Tamil. And but however, I just want to say, you know, open that space. But then again, then comes the question of what English. And also then comes the question of how much English can you wield without necessarily giving into the Western construct in which English is held hostage. And especially, you know, when we're writing today or speaking or, you know, doing activism, I find that the first site of hijack for neoliberal capitalism is language itself. And the way everything has become, you know, the words they use, a word like neutralize. What does neutralize mean? Neutralize is used to, you know, talk about the killing of people becomes neutralization. The word development, for instance, often means land grab, and, you know, and that is where I think that when you're a writer or a translator, you also need to be so attuned to voices on the ground to resist this capture of language.
I think actually our work is very much about examining the lies within language and what those lies, as you were saying, Meena, what those lies enable power to do to people, you know.
It's also interesting that, you know, you talked about Farrokhzad, who's not only a poet but also a physician, and his latest book that you also mentioned is a pictogram.
Yes.
And I find that also so relevant here. You know, I think what we've been also grappling with in this biennial and the timeline of this edition in particular, that has been so much around the destruction and erasure of various cultures and ways of life, is the limitation of artistic expression as well in some senses, you know. And so to build in process, to build in error, to build in a sense of a space for grief, and a space for change as something that is slow, and you know, in that sense, this is all, I think, very present amidst us, and I hope you've sensed that when you visit the biennial. But this idea of the poem as pictogram was something that really also, it kind of immediately creates that sense of urgency, but also of what escapes expression.
Definitely. Well, the title of this book that we're talking about, it's ... So it's actually an unsayable title, and he has spoken about the fact that he wanted it to be unsayable in order for it to be impossible to find, you know, to take it outside of industry and this sort of fast moving of literature and art as objects. So I think this is also a way of resistance in itself. Yeah.
And I don't want to only be stuck with grief, because there is also the many shades of tenderness and love as part of raging in a world, also present with us. And of course, desire, and a lexicon of desire that is very much braided with rebellion, is also so crucial to your practice, Meena. And again, just one quote from Fadi. He says, "Love is convinced that it is the source of life, and life is convinced that without it, love is nothing. And in fact, non-human life on earth," because we are going to come to non-human references, "which is most of life, has no need for love. Love is necessary for humans, because without it, we are destroyers of worlds, and with it, we still struggle not to be destroyers." So this.
I didn't hear a question, but I think it's about love. Yes, sorry. No, the thing is, you know, we were speaking about resistance. We are talking about this grand or broader scheme of things. But Natasha, when you talk about this thing as love that sets us apart, but also what makes us human, is that in the very particular context of caste, for instance, where the system itself can be maintained only through an elaborate system of arranged marriages, and where women have to be controlled in a way on where they get married or to whom they marry, and where love plays this huge role as social disruptor. Like it can it can dismantle the entire system, it can entirely bring it down, which is why it's often punished with honor killings or ostracization or setting people apart. And therefore, in a very actual context, and we're not even talking about you know, love for all or loving humanity, but in a very particular act of, you know, one person loving another person, you cause this social disruption, which is why it's sometimes punished with death. Or honor killings. And I think that it has this revolutionary potential, just like one person deciding to say, I will love this person or I will live with this person. And I think that that is a fundamental basis of, you know, movement building as well. That in Tamil Nadu, for instance, they introduced or even legislated what is called the self-respect marriage, because more and more people were saying we are going to reject, you know, this caste or religious ideas of who we should marry, and we want to be together in love. And I think that, yeah, it's a very powerful force that again has been commodified by capitalism and you know.
I just want to add that, you know, in the current political economic system we're living in is a death machine. It's a system that produces value through destruction, you know, as Fadi is saying. And I think love here is sort of the impulse to care for life. And that is why it becomes, you know, disruptive or radical. But for me, this love that we're talking about is also a way of recognizing ourselves as human in our writing or in each other's eyes while we struggle, you know, because struggle and activism forces us to become hard sometimes, you know, hard-skinned in face of so much violence. And for us to sort of write about our loving and our grieving is a way of saying, like, there is humanity that drives me to this fight, you know, not this hard surface that you see. Yeah.
It's just one question before I invite you, Meena, to read. This may be also a capacious question, but I'm really interested in how you both voice poetic ethics. And this stays, at least for me, is nurtured within, whether you're writing a piece of journalism, which I know you're going to kind of read an excerpt from a recent journalistic piece, but it also is present in the kind of first-person narratives that you both build. So you all are not bystanders in your writing. You all are, there is a sense, which is something I also think about as a curator, how can a certain poetic ethics be built in such that you are not a bystander?
As a reader, you mean, or as a writer, or
as
both?
a writer, actually, as a writer.
Yeah.
And especially when you move between this kind of direct first-person experience, you draw from your life stories and the life stories of elders around you and those in struggle. How to navigate it while positioning yourself again in this kind of momentum, in this sort of uneven ground.
Yeah.
So you want to go first? Well, Natasha, the thing is, I'm 40 years old now, and when I was growing up, let's say in the 80s, it was a time of a lot of radical liberation movements. The Tigers who were asking for a separate homeland, who were in turn, inspired by Palestine, were inspired by the PLO, and I think this was a time when writers were situated inside the movements. So the idea that you will have to be an outsider is a very, again, late capitalism, neoliberal, new construct. And this entire idea that you have to be an ally, therefore you have to stand outside, and therefore you cannot talk about the struggle, because when you talk about the struggle, you appropriate the struggle. All of this is neoliberal mental gymnastics. Because, I grew up in the 80s, I grew up, early 90s. You were part of the struggle. Writers were part of the struggle. Writers were killed for being part of the struggle. Writers were assassinated for being part of the struggle. I heard from a poet who was, considered the state poet of the Tigers, that the army used to use his face to do their target practice. So this was like, you were so much in the thick of the struggle. And the question we need to ask, I think, on broader reflection, is when did writers start getting divorced from struggles? Because that, I think, will actually let us know how capitalism played on certain types of identity politics, certain types of saying this is appropriation, this is not appropriation, telling people to stay in their lane, not because people had to stay in their lane, but just to fragment movements, to fragment solidarity, to fragment the coming together of resistance, So this is where I come from. Like, I cannot imagine being a writer and not being inside a struggle. So
I couldn't agree more. And I think for me, my family history of the Iranian Revolution, which was lost and brought us to Sweden, is really also what brought me to writing, being a part of these revolutionary communities, or being a part of these diasporic communities, and seeing the difference between the stories that my elders told about themselves and the stories that were told about them in the hegemonist society made me start thinking about narration, That is sort of my impulse to narration, so I cannot separate that. And I grew up without a sister, unfortunately, and it was always my biggest dream to have a sister, but I didn't have a sister. And when I write, I think what I want to do is really to address this sister, to make it possible for her to be embodied in my writing. That is, what I mean by that is to address somebody who knows, who has lived the same experiences, not to address the person who of power or the person who should be enlightened. It is for them too, it is for everybody. But I want to address this sister so she can emerge and say, no, it wasn't like that, in a way that I can believe and trust and have confidence in, Yeah.
Thank you, that's beautiful. And with that, I'm going to invite you, Meena, to read, and you can just... so we'll start with the short clip.
विद्रोही कौन है? भूपेश बघेल कौन सी लगमा? हक के लिए लड़ेंगे, 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 हक के लिए लड़ेंगे, 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 हक के लिए लड़ेंगे, 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 हक के लिए लड़ेंगे, लड़ेंगे, लड़ेंगे। बंद करो, बंद करो, बंद करो, जिंदाबाद, जिंदाबाद, जिंदाएंगे, जिंदाएंगे, लड़ेंगे, 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 जीतेंगे, जीतेंगे, बनाएंगे, 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 बचाएंगे, 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 नहीं छोड़ेंगे, 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 बंद करो, बंद करो।
Yeah, this was written after my visit to Silgir in May 2022. And for context, Silgir is an Adivasi village in the heart of Bastar where there's no water, no electricity, no toilets, no school in the nearby 4 or 5 kilometers. Nobody owns a moped. But where, you know, military is setting up its camps and, you know, there's, as people are fighting resource extraction. So there's a small excerpt from what I wrote. The slogans are electrifying and raucous. Uttered by tens of thousands of people, it holds a strange swaying power. I hear children not less than 5 utter them in unison. For every adult I see at the march, I see a child in someone's arms or a child who should possibly be at school. This is not committed activists alone turning up to commemorate a bloody incident, but entire villages have been mobilized. I meet people there who walked for 3 days to reach here. I march with the Adivasi people towards the main road, or rather the march carries me forward. I fall into chanting. My own loudness startles me. Every time we say Inqilab Zindabad, I feel a shy reserve about lifting my right arm up in the air, fist clenched, but I overcome the awkwardness. I'm here to protest too. I watch other local reporters and remember that I have to be running alongside them on the margins if I want to get better pictures. As we help each other climb half-built bridges and walk across concertina wires, I look at the other journalists with wide-eyed surprise. They are very good at their jobs. Not one of them is seen mouthing the slogans. The previous day, during a late evening smoking break, I heard many of them came away feeling they were sympathetic to the Adivasi struggle. Today, I'm amazed at their ability to hold back, to watch, to bear witness, to report, to contain this urge, to throw themselves in the moment, this movement. I also admire them because this commitment is long-term. They will have to come again and again. They will have to work this terrain, and being seen as a sympathizer will make them pay the price with either their job or their life. The word media commands immense respect among the Adivasi people who have turned up for this march. We say media, media, and run ahead, and the sea of people parts, giving us way to move forward. When we emerge at the front line of the march, the enormous significance hits me. There are barricades which the marching Adivasis cannot cross. On the other side, there are paramilitary officers and soldiers, all dressed up in their combat gear, their fingers on the trigger, standing to attention, assault rifles on hand. It is a face-off. The Adivasi protesters keep chanting, and slowly the leaders begin to address them. As media people, a few of us get to move past the barricade and shoot pictures from the center of the standoff. We observe that the paramilitary has better cameras than some of us. For them, the barricade is a site of surveillance, documentation. Some of the senior officers already identify us. They have been briefed by every outside journalist presence. Our position is precarious. First, on the firing line, our position is precious. We are the buffer sandwiched between the fully armed brute power of the state machinery and the fierce Adivasis peacefully demanding justice. One side is armed with guns, the other side with slogans. I think of the enormous power vested in the hands of these young Adivasi leaders. If they decide to push against the barricades in a symbolic manner, their sheer numbers will allow them to march ahead. However, there will be bloodshed. This is not the time for bravado. Like true leaders, they hold their ranks in place. Among the many speeches made that morning, there's a speech addressing the soldiers. Quickly thereafter, the cultural troupe breaks into song. सुनो जवानों प्यारे साथियों, सुनो भारत के इतिहास को देखो, सुनो जन विरोधी नीतियों को छोड़ो रे, सुनो जन संघर्षों से नाता जोड़ो रे. Sorry, my Hindi is bad. Listen, soldiers, dear friends, look at Indian history, abandon anti-people policies, make tie with the people's struggles. Imagining this working class utopia of solidarity is a distant dream. In the aftermath of offensive, large-scale militarization that has lasted decades and the shadow of a shootout that claimed Adivasi lives, this gesture is not what one anticipates on such divided turf. Eventually, when the speeches are finished and the songs have all been sung, the march retreats back to the village of Silgar. This is in the middle of the month of May, the hottest summer in the calendar, and everyone is drenched in sweat. When the masses returns, the same slogans echo through the heavy afternoon air. Thank you.
I will read you a little bit in Swedish and the rest in English in Jennifer Hayashida's translation from my latest book, Åsnans år, Donkey Days, in English. Tänk att något så bespottat kan gjutas i porslin, säger jag till min dotter på loppisen. Hon tittar upp från det begagnade pusslet, ser den kantstötta packåsnan med grammig och päls och förorättad uppsyn som jag hittat bland köksgeråden. På persiska, förklarar jag, finns det 2 ord för åsna som båda är en förolämpning och ett tredje som är åsneöra, men det betyder kanin. Jag bär hem åsnan och ställer den bredvid spisen. Fyller korgarna med gurkmeja och kanel. Min dotter sticker in en tandpetare i munnen så att höet hänger ut. Jag stryker min vän över öronen och viskar: nu är det du och jag, lilla dysterkvist. Det är inget särskilt väder längre. Varken sol, vind, snö eller regn. Bara en grå, oansenlig himmel. Var inte dum, invände min dotter. Vinden finns också när du inte ser den. Jag steker vitlök i rapsolja till en auberginröra från Kaspiska havet. Gurkmejan fläckar ner mosaiken. Min dotter hämtar sina tuschpennor och säger: vi målar allting gult. Vid hoven förr i tiden prydde man borden med figuriner som avbildade politiska händelser för att förse middagssällskapen med samtalsämnen. Vi ställer fram miniatyrer av oss själva i porslin, avsedda att leda uppmärksamheten från och till oss själva. Gör oss aptitliga för vilken makt det nu är som håller oss gisslan. Slokar med huvudet mellan 2 motbjudande hötappar. O proletarian of the animal world, how many times your weight have you carried? All the surplus value you give rise to and all the contempt you receive in exchange. When the whip doesn't wail, the carrot dangles like an unattainable reward. And the horse's equal you will never be. What fate for a creature. I can take your baskets now. The tulips are growing, my daughter exclaims, of the bulbs she planted with her aunt when we were waiting for her sister. Oh, that's great, honey, I mumble, like a dumb mother in January who knows that spring takes time. Donkey, look out of your window. Little shoots of confidence emerge from the frosty soil. Come, I say, Let's build a wall, as if a ring of stones could defend against rabbits and rangers. With the stupidity of mothers, I sing of how a donkey ear skips up to a baby mouse who, terrified, hides in a hole. Mother Mouse is a wise woman. She takes one look at donkey ear and says, "Don't be silly, it is a guest. Run back, introduce yourself, and bring donkey ear back." We live like donkeys here, like nursery rhymes, haul garlic and dried lime from exile to stove. The walnuts all ready to be roasted. The pomegranate syrup is in the fridge. Oh, let me return to my barn, rest my head in the hay like a threadbare invective. There is a moment when the moon is high and stalks twist toward the sky. If you whisper the name of the dead, they do not reply. But if the foals sleep in the box, you can hear yourself bray. Thank you.
So in regards to the donkey and to carry, I guess there's very direct connections, but the donkey, as Meena was saying, also is a highly esteemed and respected figure. It is not only the beast of burden. So in terms of cultural relationality to this figure of the donkey, and the male donkey and the female, no, there's differences, I guess. And I was thinking a lot about the donkey also as a transoceanic figure, because you have donkeys from Oman traveling to Lamu, and so the story of migration as well stays inscribed, as well as the kind of these historicities inscribed in the non-human subject. And this is a fantastic entire book, but maybe just a few words, perhaps.
Yeah. I thought it was so funny when I found out that the theme of the biennial was carrying, because when I finished this book, I realized that I had written an entire book about donkeys because I needed to write a book about carrying, and I didn't know that from the beginning, but it's a book about carrying, carrying your heritage in a migrant, context, but also carrying literally children, carrying sort of the burdens of the projections of humans on donkeys as both the sort of frowned upon beast of burden and also this sort of elevated creature. It's exactly like you say. I mean, Columbus had donkeys on his ship. So really with the spread of European colonialism, donkeys sort of built up civilizations all over the world. But actually, ultimately, this is a book about grief that you were mentioning, because grief is, in one way, the final burden or the ultimate cargo, because once it has been loaded upon you, you will carry it forever. You will never be able to lay grief down until you yourself are dead, and somebody has to carry that burden for you,
Right. Oh, Meena, there's hardly any time left, which is kind of shocking. We have a lot to talk about, but yeah, I wanted to there's another set of book of poems, Tomorrow Someone Will Arrest You, and the verse from, if I'm not wrong, the title work goes, "In that land of words where I handcraft my dreams, we do not have alphabets that disappear into silences. Instead, the only rule, what you see is what you say. Nothing seen goes unsaid." And I was thinking, how that relates to this piece, this excerpt that you read from Silger, and this act of witnessing in continuum, so in this kind of continuous present mode, which is not only true to your journalism, but also true to your poetry, but also the way that you witness with other poet activists like Varvara Rao, for instance, who has been imprisoned several times. So we don't have to go into details, but yeah, please feel welcomed to respond in any way that you like.
Well, I'll find a suitably roundabout way to talk about all of this. I think that something very interesting is, like earlier I pointed out about language, but also the language in which writers are treated, is that on multiple times we have seen the idea that, you know, like somebody like Sai Baba, who's also a poet, who spent like 10 decades in solitary confinement and later died after coming out of prison, or like Varavara Rao, he's more than 82 years old, he was a poet, again he was in jail. And when you realize that, you know, many of the poets are in prison, and people are also being thrown in prison for some books they have at home, this kind of thing. And I think at some point the court also remarked that, you know, ideas are more dangerous than guns, you know, because I think we are living through all of these multiple narratives. And I think what has actually happened is there is an equation, you know, of the people who carry guns and the people who carry pens. So the thinking that, you know, if you curtail the writer, if you silence the writer, in some ways you're subjugating the resistance. I think it's become, it's not published, it's not publicly said aloud, but every action points towards that. And this is where I think it becomes even more imperative as a writer to actually write about the resistance and write about all the many protests or many, you know, people's movement that are happening everywhere. Because in some ways you feel that enormous responsibility, because we also are living in a time when the media itself cannot do so much. The media is under a lot of corporate ownership, but also a lot of self-censorship, and I think these things make it the imperative of, you know, writers to talk about it. But I just want to also come back to poetry here, like why poetry? I mean, when all of this is happening, what is it about poetry? And I think, at least for the writers in prison, it was easier to smuggle it out, like easier to actually to have it said, to have it transcribed. Because I saw Sai Baba's, you know, when we put together his wife, he had just written as if it was a love letter to his wife, but just used a dash to show it's a line break. Because you're not allowed in prison to write, so you write this as a letter to your lover, or his wife, and then it comes out as a letter, and then it becomes a poem outside of the prison. So I think that the idea of poetry being so intrinsic to all of this is where, I think that's where they meet.
Thank you. I think we'll have to go straight into the next reading, which will have to be brief. Sorry.
Hi again. So I will read from another book called White Blight. Also this in Jennifer Hayashi, there's English translation. My father said, since no one who belongs to you is buried in this earth does not belong to you. My mother said, only when you bury me in this earth will this earth belong to you. My mother said, like a mummy's bandage you bind up the story, like a river where the dirty waters of history run. My mother said, time will catch up with your tongue. My mother said, you go through everything in search of something to disfigure. My mother said, only the line that provokes my tears do you consider worthy of notation. My father said, who is speechless in a poem about language? My grandmother said, who is bared in a poem about desire? My mother said, who is betrayed in a poem about betrayal? My brother said, the price is never as high as when you think no one will pay. My father said, "Show me someone who's abandoned their language, and I will show you the one who no language contains." My father said, "Speak the language that pays for your bread." My mother said, "Speak the language that keeps its distance from what has taken place in words." My brother said, "Speak the language worth the price of betraying me." My mother said, "Your difference is immobile and mute. No, your difference is a conjured monster demanding its tribute. Your difference is doomed to repeat its question." My brother said, "The only language you have to condemn the crime is the language of the criminal, and the language of the criminal is a language invented to justify the crime." Thank you.
I'm going to read two short poems because we are short on time. You who never run out of words. You who never run out of words, comrade, who bombards me with endless numbered arguments. How do you believe in absolutes as the seas rise, as ice shells break, as spring comes in winter, as monsoon turns into a torrent of cyclones, as life halts for years and days resemble abandoned roads? Here life is a roll of dice, a vagabond's paradise, but you dream in black and white, punctuate small talk with your slogans, dazzle us with history as anecdote, joke, warning. Broken within, I ramble to a friend who soon turns lover. The comrade, he's my conscience, but he has my heart, but he's unadulterated gold, too pure to be a jewel, too soft to hold a gem. To his spotless blue sky, I'm a thunderstorm, sending forth portents. We share you like a secret, I promise to be strong. In the kitchen, you and I, we hear the radio. The earth is on fire, the reports say. And I ask you, unsure, if we did right in having children. And for the first time, comrade, I catch your silence. The other poem I would read is the one that Natasha made a reference to earlier on, also because I think that we're followed by a session about the alphabet. And this is called A Silent Letter. We met halfway in English, a habit then a language, precise as bullets in your politics, raw as a knife wound in my poetry. You bathing every English word in your mother tongue as if this was the only way of settling down. You switching to French in pain, the sudden pardon, the unexpected oui that tells me you are dreaming, tells me you have touched ground. How do I come to your home? In that land of words where I handcraft my dreams, we do not have alphabets that disappear into silences. Not for us the unspoken sibilants, the gliding liquids, an elision at the end of words, these contortions of sophistication. Our vowels, we call them life. Our consonants, we treat them as the body where this life begins to breathe, makes meaning, makes love, makes do. Everything is meant to be pronounced. Here, the only rule, what you say, what you see is what you say. Nothing seen goes unsaid. I struggle with a tongue tied to its roots, untrained to let things slide, that does not know to suppress sound, that is dying to come home to you, instead stays a stranger at your door.
Athena, you know that I'm absolutely in love with White Blight, with Swit, and it was a really important reference actually for me in terms of making this biennial and sort of thinking about polyphony, also in terms of the polyphony between us as 5 women from different parts of the world, and the way you invoke that polyphony as this single voice that is still continuing to search for relationality. And I was thinking as well of the kind of aphorisms and anachronisms that allow for it then, that there's so much room for disagreement and difference in the way that you write. And I was also thinking a lot about this one quote by James Baldwin, who said, which goes, "You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's time, and my sister's time, my niece's and my nephew's time. How much time do you need for your progress?" So again, this speaking with and across time and relation.
Thank you so much. I've been obsessed with James Baldwin for years, decades, and of course with this quote, but I never put that in relation to my book. So when you say it, it makes so much sense, actually, the brother, the sister, the mother. But while writing this book, and it was some time ago, I think it was very important for me to find a form that could contain, disagreement, to find this sort of polyphony that would sort of point in many different directions and at the same time be carried as a whole. And I guess that is also your task when you curate, because this is truth to me. This is a way of depicting truth, of saying we are all this, we are all these disagreements, but we are still a family, we're still a diaspora, we're still a movement containing all of this, and sometimes, turning against each other, but at the same time, standing together. Yes, that's crucial for me.
Thank you. And as I turn to you again, Meena, I'm trying to kind of collapse so much of what you've done, also as a translator, in fact, and I think the Tirukkural, sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but composed in the 1st century BC, and that has been translated several times, but you've made the first feminist intervention in translation of this ancient text, and you spent 12 years doing so. And I found that one of the aspects that I'd love for you to draw on is, the body of poetry, the embodiment and the rupture of, of the poem as a body, as a corpus, because the chorale is, as you said, sort of similar to a haiku, but it also reveals so much about the density of Tamil philosophy and culture. And at the same time, the way that you've written poetry, it often also kind of contests with the single narrative, with marginalia on the side. So it's kind of also breaking the page to, again, allow for plurality, polyphony, narrative and counter-narrative. And that is going to be my last question. But yeah, please do take your time.
The Tirukkural is a very interesting text because it was the first Tamil text I read. I studied in a school where I learned Hindi and English, and so I had to learn my own mother tongue as a teenager, and it was also very close to the time I fell in love, so the love poetry of the Chorale was very special to me. But it took me many years to realize that in 2000 years of this text, that not a single woman had translated it. And that tells you so much about culture, right? Once something becomes high culture and, important, like the heartbeat of your culture, then there is gatekeeping and what can women touch. And so for me, the thing is, and these are 250 small poems that form the Chorale, and the heart of it is always a woman who is striking terror, a woman who is intimidating to the men. The man says, I never knew what is death before, but then I look at her eyes and I know what is death. She's so powerful, and she's a Tamil woman, but that woman does not exist outside the text to talk about the text. She does not exist as a paratextual incarnation. She's not a commentator, she's not a translator, she's not a philosopher of the love of the text. She can only be that girl inside the book, or that girl inside a man's narrative. And for me, it was very important to take that claim and say, if she's so powerful and intimidating inside, why can't she exist outside and actually talk about this book? But the thing is, this kind of rupture that I talk about, I think that translation is very powerful because these words, this language exists, the lexicons exist. You can go and fight with anybody. You can fight and say, how do you, for instance, how do you define this word if it doesn't exist in the original? Why do you add this layer of meaning? Why do you sanitize a text? And these are fights that I think are very important because somehow the fact that the text is old does not mean it's not modern. The Kural itself is very modern in its outlook, in its understanding of female desire, but so many uncles have, you know, done what uncles do to books and texts. And I think sometimes it was much more a rescue operation of a hostage situation than, you know, just me trying to be revolutionary. And but thank you for this question, and thank you for, you know, having me here.
Thank you for this precious conversation, which will continue a long time from now.